on, to some extent, the amount of these materials that are in the soil. And these are held by charges on the clay fraction of the soil. So the amount of these in the soil we call base saturation. So as soils leach, these cations are removed from the soil. So as precipitation increases, the amount of these metal cation nutrients is decreased. So if we compare, say, the southeastern part of the United States or tropical soils, they typically have much lower levels of these metal cations than soils, say, in relatively young environment like the western part of Ohio, where we've only had 12,000 years of leaching, even under a 40-inch rainfall condition. So there's some just very general rules about precipitation, and we can also say similar things about temperature. So organic matter accumulation decreases as temperature increases due to the increased breakdown of organic matter that we call mineralization, and decreased effectiveness of precipitation, because if we have higher temperatures, we get more evapotranspiration and therefore drier soils typically. So we can see that if climate change influences temperature, and we know it already is influencing that, increasing temperature, then we would actually expect that organic matter in soils is going to break down. But remember, we also get increased production to some extent with higher temperatures. But it's complicated, of course, because it depends on the seasons. But another long-term effect is how soils form, that process we call weathering. Soil weathering increases as temperature increases. So if we go to the tropics where we have very hot soils, soils are strongly developed. They've been very strongly leached. They're typically, at least in well-drained environments, red in color due to the accumulation of oxides that have developed by the weathering of soil minerals and leaving residual iron and aluminum oxides as the major minerals in the soil and giving soils those red colors. So as we go to the southern states of the United States, soils tend to get redder and even more so into the tropics. But other forms of soil weathering also increase. Remember that as temperature increases, microorganisms and plants can grow faster. So we talk about weathering, the change of the original minerals in the soil parent material, the amount of residual weatherable minerals decreases as temperature increases. So in Ohio, we have some residual minerals. If you look in many Ohio soils, we can see things like micas, and deep in the soil, we might see calcium carbonate from the limestone or lime-rich glacial deposits. We still have some of these minerals that can break down over time because we're in kind of this mid-latitude climate. But as temperature increases, weathering will increase, and therefore the amount of these residual minerals will decrease. We've already talked about base saturation decreasing. It also decreases as temperature goes up because of the faster rate of chemical reactions in soils. And then minerals formed in soils like clay is produced in soils as they weather. These will tend to increase as temperature increases. So hot places tend to have more clay, everything else being equal. Clay formation increases. So as temperature increases. So these are just some kind of general rules of thumb. And again, they operate sort of at the continental and regional scale, not so much at the scale of farm fields and forests. So these are kind of climate changes that affect long-term soil development. So what kind of soils do we get in different places? So climate has affected those things, but much more important to us, I think, when we think about climate changes, dynamic changes related to things like soil organic matter and the microorganisms and plants and animals that live in soils. And I think these are where most of our thinking and concentration is in terms of climate change. And we know that soil is a staggeringly diverse environment or ecosystem that we really don't understand very well. As I mentioned earlier, the effects on the microbial community and relationships between microbes, plants, and the soil matrix is really just in its infancy in terms of science. So we don't know as much as we need to be able to make predictions or even manage the system well. But we know that climate change is going to have profound effects on interactions between soils, microorganisms, and plants. And this is important because soils play the central role in the global carbon cycle. So if we think about how climate is changing and will change, we are aware of ideas and models that show, and measurements that show higher temperatures. Probably we're already seeing effects of higher summer temperatures and more frequent heat waves in Ohio and across many parts of the United States and the world. Generally, rainfall's increasing to some extent. And we, as far as models go, you know, there's some uncertainty here, but higher rainfall is likely. But even more likely is higher intensity of rainfall. So if we think about how this might affect soils, you know, if we get very intense short storms, that's actually less effective for getting water into the soil because more water is likely to run off under those conditions. We are also likely to get much more potential for soil erosion where we have high intensity storms increasing. And then we have influences on fire frequency, which can remove vegetation that protects the soil in various ways and adds carbon to the soil. I'm not going to reiterate for much time what we expect and know about climate change. I'll just very quickly summarize from some work done at University of Massachusetts, and I acknowledge that. And I'll provide references to all of this material in the PowerPoint that we will be posting later. So we know that temperatures are increasing, and we know that there are various models that relate to different levels of emissions. But we've already had changes in Ohio over, you know, even in the last 150 years. And we see this, we expect these things to increase. And so, you know, within the noisy signal, we know that the temperature is increasing. This is the mean annual temperature. So since 1895, it's been about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.7 Celsius in Ohio. And we know that models are going to show this happening. And it will be something that is dependent on the season. So depending on what happens with the climate, we may get warmer winters, but we may even have, you know, some summers, the very warmest ones actually may end up being cooler. But we could see this overall effect over time. But it will depend a lot on what kind of emissions targets we can meet. If we just kind of look at this, you know, in an overall way, I think this is quite a sort of useful way to think about what can happen or what might be the extremes. So if we think about forests and farms and gardens, you know, what kind of conditions we have in Ohio for the northern part of the deciduous forests zone, we're going to be much more like Arkansas probably later in this century. So you could see the kinds of summer conditions that we're going to have, but our winter conditions might be more like the mid-Atlantic. And again, these, you know, no one knows, and I'm not claiming anything more than just showing what some models are showing. But we know, as well as these seasonal changes, that we'll have extremes. And so we expect that dependent on the atmospheric greenhouse gases, that we may have many more hot days, very hot days in the future in our summers. And that's going to influence soil development and the relationship between soils, plants, and microorganisms. Rainfall, similar effects, 15 of the last 20 years. This was up until 2015, I think, but precipitation had somewhat increased. But probably more important in terms of influences on the soil, heavy precipitation, the top 1% of storms that create most soil erosion, for example, those kinds of events are definitely increasing and will continue to increase. So we will have probably cooler, moister winters to some extent, but our snowfall may go down. Again, these are just some model ideas that may influence how soils develop. I won't spend more time on that. We've all seen that kind of ad nauseum, but I did want to, since I talked about what general effects climate have on soils, just put it in the context of the kind of changes that we may see. Well, this all brings us back to soil's role in the carbon cycle. So this work from the IPCC work, this is not the most recent data, but I think it, these numbers are at least generally accepted for how much carbon is moving and being stored in various parts of the environment. So I just wanted to point out a few parts of the carbon cycle that are important to us. And so these numbers are in petograms. It's very hard to wrap our minds, our brains around how much that is. But if we think about billions of tons of carbon, that's probably a little bit more relatable than the standard international unit of petograms. But we can see here that we know, various estimates, are averaging about 2,000 pg of long-term carbon, organic carbon is stored in soils. So these box numbers give the amount of the stock, or the amount of stored carbon. We can see then that soils, the organic carbon in soils on an average across our planet globally is significantly higher than that stored in the above ground biomass, or even the total biomass of vegetation. We can see that it's also significantly higher, at least 3 times as high as the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So that's the significant thing to remember, that soils are the most important terrestrial solid, in terms of the land mass. Soils are the most important sink for carbon. But we also need to be aware of the range of these numbers and the fluxes. How much is being removed in a given year, and dependent on where we are and measurements, we may be losing every year in some places 30 pg, or we may actually be gaining carbon depending on where we are and how this is measured. That puts in context how much is being generated into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels. So the fluxes from soil are significantly higher than those of fossil fuel use. And this is what drives our conclusion as soil scientists and others involved in this, that we may have important influence over what happens in the global carbon cycle by what we do with soils. You know, if we can maximize, we can minimize the flux and maximize the storage, obviously that will have a very strong influence. The same thing, of course, goes for above ground biomass. So if we can store carbon as woodland owners, as foresters, we want to do that too. So this is not an either or situation. There's no competition here, but we do need to recognize this important issue with soils. And so what's important, you know, are the annual fluxes, right? But also this long-term flux. And so large amounts of carbon have been lost from soil over time, mostly due to agriculture. So that's the kind of global carbon cycle. Putting this more in context of soils. So we believe that soils store about or more than 2,000 pg of carbon in the organic fraction, or more than 2 trillion tons, or 2,000 billion tons of carbon. It's a lot. So we can see then that soil is the largest terrestrial store of carbon, you know, roughly 3 times as much as the atmosphere. If we think about the top part of the soil, the top 6 inches or 15 centimeters or so of the soil, it's got a lot of carbon. So I'd like to point out how much is in the surface, because this is the part that we have the highest influence over. You know, we manage the soil at the surface mostly. We add materials to soils, we take it away. That's the part of the soil that's most influenced by erosion and land management. So that's a lot of carbon, and this can change fairly quickly. Okay, so we could see again in the top 200 centimeters, we have a lot more carbon than in the atmosphere. So the first 30 centimeters of soil contains about that much, almost a double amount. You know, again, these numbers vary depending on where you get these numbers. So this information here is from the International Soil Resource Information Center, which is an agency in Western Europe, and this is from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So more than 60% of the carbon, more than 60% of stored carbon in the top 30 centimeters is in only a relatively few large countries: Russia, Canada, United States, China, Brazil, Indonesia, Australia, and some others. And you will recognize many of these as major agricultural and forest products producers in the world. And so these are the places where most carbon is stored, and they're also the places where most carbon is influenced. So let's talk about the fluxes. In the post-industrial period, mostly the period, you know, here in terms of soils, we're mostly talking about modern agriculture. About 25% of all the carbon that's been emitted into the atmosphere came from agriculture, and that's very significant. So what we do in the future in agriculture, to a large extent, will have a very big influence on how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere. But it's a kind of complex and multi-level story here, because as well as contributing to atmospheric greenhouse gases, this loss of carbon of organic matter from agricultural and other managed soils reduces plant productivity, because soil carbon is involved in nutrient cycling, in water movement in soils, in water storage in soils, in the relationship between soil microbes and plants, such as, for the fixation of nitrogen, the cycling of nutrients. All of these things are disturbed when soil carbon is lost. So if we can reverse the loss of carbon from soils, that many of these important parts of ecosystem services will be enhanced. And so, bringing the carbon cycle down to the more local level here, we can see how carbon gets into soil via breakdown of the plant biomass and its incorporation into the soil as organic matter, incorporation of senescent plant roots, but we also get losses. So over time, much of that organic matter that's included in the soil gets incorporated into microbial biomass, some of it into animals that may get back into the soil, but some of that carbon then is mineralized each year or even each day and lost into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And we know all plants and organisms respire to some extent, and most of these will produce carbon dioxide in that respiration process. There are also going to be effects from organisms on the inorganic carbon components. So if we add acids to the soil via the breakdown of organic matter, these will dissolve some of this calcium carbonate in soils and also generate carbon dioxide. So this is the kind of local carbon cycle that influences the amount of carbon in the soil and to some extent atmospheric carbon. But it's not simple, and it's highly spatially variable. Different soils store different amounts of soil organic carbon. The largest amounts of carbon in soils are stored in the northern permafrost region due to low temperatures and slow organic matter decomposition and generally wet soil. So if we look to the permafrost areas, the tundra, that's where the largest amounts of carbon are stored, 190 PG just in those permafrosted soils. So that's a third of, almost a third of all stored carbon in soils is in those permafrosted soils. This is, of course, a very big concern because these soils are at great risk of warming due to global climate change. As these soils warm up, carbon loss due to microbial decomposition and even melting of some of that permafrost will liberate some of that stored organic carbon. That will then send more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, creating a strong feedback loop. And this is one of the main concerns for long-term climate change, that as those soils warm, they're going to even generate more carbon into the atmosphere and then create this feedback loop. Other soils that have high carbon storage include wetlands and peatlands and some areas of volcanic soils in various parts of the world. Typically, grassland soils store relatively high levels of carbon because of the below-ground biomass associated with grasses and forbs in those ecosystems. So if you want to get more carbon into the soil long-term, grasslands may be a good choice in some parts of, in some ecosystems, particularly perennial grasslands. Areas of low plant productivity are places where we have relatively small amounts of carbon, such as deserts. So this is a relatively recent mapping application on soil carbon. Given time, I don't think I was going to get into this, but you can go to this application and map global estimates of carbon. It's on a fairly detailed scale, so we could go to Ohio here and see the amounts of carbon stocks of stored carbon in various places. So it's an interesting application to look at. just generally looking at this overall map here, we can see the places where larger amounts of soil carbon is stored. So as I mentioned, the permafrosted regions, the tundra across Alaska and northern Canada, through northern Europe, northern Russia, Siberia, where very large amounts of carbon are stored on a broad scale. Places like Iceland, through some parts of the volcanic areas of the tropics, like Indonesia, where you've got tropical rainforest and volcanic soils. These are also areas of high carbon storage. The world's grasslands come next. So wetlands and permafrosted areas have the highest levels, but if we look at the large areas of the world's grasslands here, we can see through here the steppes of Central Asia, the pampas in South America, the prairies of the United States have moderately high levels of stored carbon. And then the low areas of carbon stored in soils include the world's deserts, large areas in Australia and the Sahel in Africa, the Middle East and western parts of North America. So it's worthwhile having a look at this if you want to get a sense of where carbon exists. So let's talk about a little bit about the effects on soil microbial and plant relationships. These diagrams come from a very interesting paper by Claassen that talks about what is known about the influences of climate change on microbial and plant relationships in the soil. So we can understand that we have these various carbon feedbacks, and then there will be a direct effect then on organisms that live in and on the soil as climate changes. So direct effects on climate act directly on organism processes and the amount of organic matter that's added and lost, and also influences on inorganic carbon as well, to directly move carbon either into the soil or back into the atmosphere. So dependent on what happens with climate change, changes in temperature and precipitation, concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and even deposition of nitrogen, that will change productivity and the influences of various organisms, but it's extremely complex. But as well as that, we have indirect effects regarding organisms. This might include a shift in the above ground and below ground properties. So diversity, a composition of plant and microorganism communities, the different kinds of plants and what functions they perform in the environment. And the same goes for microbes and other organisms in the soil. And interactions among these are going to indirectly influence carbon pools and feedbacks. So we could expect a very broad range of responses from the complex community of plants and microorganisms in and on soils. So this could range from those that have absolutely no response to climate change to various ways in which microorganisms and plants are going to be affected. So we might have a change in the kinds of plants that can grow. So imagine if our summer temperatures are more like the southern states of the United States, then there's going to be some changes, for example, to plant understory, and definite changes, long term. So we may have migration of species and some change to species composition, at least in terms of vegetation, but we might not have much change in particular soil microbial communities. But it may be that microbial communities, as well as the plants that they're associated with, and this seems much more likely in many cases because there will be a response in both the plant and microorganism communities. We may have major changes in the phenology of plants as well. You know, we may change our forest types even, or our understory types. Their form and shape will also change. And that may change seasonal effects on microorganisms. There may be effects that relate to positive and negative relationships between plants and microorganisms. If we think about things like mycorrhizae and nitrogen fixing organisms related to nitrogen fixation in plant roots or free living in the soil, these kind of community shifts may also happen. You know, we may get warmer temperatures, different plants might grow different legumes, for example, different kinds of trees that may be nitrogen fixers. So that many different kinds of effects will happen. And then we may have adverse conditions. So we have very hot surface soils that might create downward movement or downshifts spatially of microorganism communities in soil. So, you know, again, these things are kind of general ideas about what may happen with climate change, and long-term studies are going to have to be established to understand the actual numbers and changes that we see there. I do want to bring this back a little bit related to forests. So one thing that we know from various studies is that the soil carbon below ground is variable, more variable than the above ground biomass in time and space. So there are various aspects of this. You know, we can see that total carbon stocks are the highest in oak hickory forests. Oh, sorry about that. Highest in oak hickory forests, but that's largely a result of the area of those kinds of forests. We can see, if we look at the area weighted, this tells us what kinds of environments or forest systems or vegetation soil systems where we have the largest amounts of stored carbon. So these are mostly associated with wet forests, wetlands, and also areas where we might have relatively cold conditions. So cold wet forests are where carbon is also concentrated closer to the surface. In oak hickory forests, for example, and more deciduous forests, we tend to get more distribution of carbon down the soil profile and less towards the surface. We have fewer O-horizons or duff layers and more active distribution down the soil profile. So this may have an interaction with climate change, for example. So surface soils are going to be far more vulnerable to changes in temperature and moisture, for example. And so, you know, the kinds of forests where we have more carbon concentrated towards the surface, those situations may be much more vulnerable to climate change. And another corollary of that might be that there may be more long-term potential for increasing soil carbon in moderate carbon storage systems that have a large area and distribute that carbon more generally into the soil profile, such as the oak hickory forests. So just some kind of broad generalizations there. So to kind of bring this to a conclusion to some extent, soil use and management definitely have a direct effect on climate change, as well as soils being affected by climate change. But soils do this by altering the emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and we can influence this via our judicious land management. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about what our broad general options are for managing that. So if we think about this, there are so many different things to do, and this could be the subject of a whole series of webinars, I think, how we could manage soil carbon to maximize storage and minimize losses in all kinds of ecosystems, including forest ecosystems. But basically anything that we can do to maximize input. So productivity is a very important part of this puzzle. But it's much more much more complex than that, because soil organic matter is a balance between inputs and losses. So in order to maintain and increase soil carbon, we need to minimize losses as well as maximize inputs. And in some cases, minimizing losses can be just as important. This means protecting what we add to the surface and protecting those high concentrations of carbon near the surface of soils. This can be done through maintaining cover over the soil right through the year. This would be true in agriculture and forest systems. Anything we can do to maintain some kind of cover, whether it's standing living cover, cover crops, or agroforestry systems, or anything we can do to keep perennials, developing perennial plants that we can harvest rather than annuals. Minimizing soil disturbances is also a very important way that we can influence soil carbon. And minimizing erosion. Erosion remains a major way that carbon is lost and redistributed in the environment. Anything we can do to enhance this depth distribution, because concentrated carbon towards the surface is most vulnerable. And finally, what we can do to enhance the balance of different organisms in soils to enhance microbial diversity. One of the major ways that we can have the largest influence is preventing the formation of deserts. So we saw that the world's deserts store the least amount of carbon, and those deserts are increasing due to changes in the environment. As we have climate change, we will see the effects of those changes in increasing the propensity of desertification. So preventing those things is going to be absolutely fundamental, and this is where the biggest effects on soil carbon can be affected. Reducing the number of grazing animals, moving animals to new areas more frequently, using conservation tillage and no-till practices in agriculture, using low-intensity, high-diversity crop rotations, agroforestry, for example, maintaining perennial vegetation, forest cover, woodland cover, and agroforestry, all kinds of ways of having perennial vegetation, increasing ground cover with irrigation, using selective and staggered tree harvest techniques rather than clear cutting to maintain perennial cover and living organisms in the soil. All of these things we've heard about many times. I won't go into more detail today. So this map, related to the others I've shown, indicates the areas that are now most vulnerable to desertification, to major changes in soil that will result in very much lower levels of vegetation growth, very much lower levels of soil carbon stocks and soil carbon storage long term. And so this is where there needs to be very, very strong action to maintain soil carbon levels. So this diagram from the European Environment Agency, I think, serves as a kind of summary for the things I've talked about related to soils and climate change. So just briefly looking at this, soils are incredibly important in terms of providing ecosystem services. Soils are a hedge against things like heat waves, particularly in the cities. They're a permeable material that has water and air and living organisms. So anything we can do to maintain that condition of soils will help us. Soil stores and filters and transforms nutrients, contaminants, and water and carbon, and living organisms, and soil organic matter play a very important role in that. Soil actually captures and stores carbon. Soil hosts a quarter of the world's biodiversity. Soils influence water offsite, preventing and regulating flooding, and of course provides 95% of the world's food supply, as well as forest products, pharmaceuticals, and industrial products that are incredibly important to us. Soils form very, very slowly, between 100 to 1,000 years to form just 1 centimeter of soil. And as I mentioned, you know, in an afternoon, we can lose all of it. Higher temperatures are going to be the key to the effects of climate change, because they influence soil microbial and plant communities, and evapotranspiration will increase, and carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere are going to increase as temperatures go up. So this below ground storage is critical. If we can maintain that, then we'll have a very, very strong influence on atmospheric carbon. This means minimal soil disturbance, so that we know things like soil disturbance, plowing, and other influences on the soil increase decomposition, mineralization rates, creating more carbon dioxide. So maintaining soil in the form of stored carbon is essential. Then there are effects related to forests. So for example, in Europe, increasing forest areas, also true in many parts of North America over the 20th century. This has stored very, very large amounts of carbon, but influences on damage related to storms and wind and things like that will also have long-term effects, as will insects, which are increasing across the world's forests, and also fire. So these are disincentives to production in forests that will also influence soil carbon. So I'll stop now, and we can open this up, and I'm very happy to be involved in a conversation and answer some questions.
Thanks, Brian. I have to say, you have some amazing graphics. I'm jealous.
Well, I also have to say that many of these, of course, I did not make. So, I will provide all of the sources for these. So,
okay.
But I think it helps us to see these to gain an understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, and like I said, these graphics really do. I'm much more of a visual person, so when you have those kind of things, it certainly helps me put things in perspective. So I really appreciate that. I wish that on our forestry side we had some of those kind of graphics, but I think for us, they're the same graphics we would have done 20, 30 years ago. So they're not quite as snazzy. But awesome presentation. Thank you very much. And we do have some questions. Let's see here. Okay, so the first one is, Frank says, in the last 2,000 years, there have been at least 2 periods of climate change, medieval warm period and little ice age. Do we know what these periods did to soils? That's
a great question, and it's something that really interests me. What I'm going to do actually is just refer to one place where I know we know something about this. Now, I am not an expert on those periods in Ohio or North America. I know a little bit about what happened in Australia, but those particular climate change periods were not really influential in Australia, believe it or not. There have been changes, but mostly in Australia there was warming and drying happened over that period. So there wasn't a little ice age, and there wasn't that medieval warming period in Australia. But I'm going to refer to a place that I've spent a lot of time, and that's Iceland. And just to quickly relate what we do know, that's one place where this is being studied intensely. And the reason is that Iceland was settled by Viking settlers about 870 AD, plus or minus a couple of years. So there were no people there before then. There were just about 25% of that country was covered with forests, birch forests, and about 50% of the country was covered with ice. The rest was mostly wetlands. So when the Viking settlers came, it was during that warm period. So they knew it was warm enough. They found a lovely warm green place. It's cold enough at some times of the year, but because of the Gulf Stream, Iceland is relatively warm for its more than 60-degree north latitude. So when they came, there were forests, and they cut them all down, and they brought grazing animals, and so they were back to less than 1% forest cover. And as temperature warmed, those forests had been increasing. We know this from pollen in wetlands and fossil evidence. And so we know those forests were increasing, and organic carbon was increasing significantly over time. And so as that happened, those soils got carbon. And then humans came along and got rid of all the forests, and severe soil erosion followed and loss of soil carbon. So probably most of soil carbon in Iceland was lost after the warm period. And then they head into the Little Ice Age from maybe the 13th century, 12th to 13th century onwards, a couple of hundred years after the Vikings had settled. All of the vegetation had been lost, severe soil erosion, and large amounts of soil loss ensued. The last 100 years, Iceland's been trying to reverse that effect. So that's one place I know how those things happen. So I think we could also extrapolate to North America that during that warm period, even though it was warm, it's not like the kind of temperatures we expect to see in the coming century. Okay, so we're already, interestingly, Iceland was totally free of ice at about 8,000 years ago. But now we still have ice there, but within 100 years or so, most of that ice is going to be gone, and we're going to be back to their Icelanders are going to have to face kind of what conditions were like about 8,000 years ago. So that's a bit of a summary in terms of what I know, which is an area where I've done some work. So,
okay, good. So Kathleen Bradley, she's going to go to the earthworm thing, Brian. Discussed before, but effective earthworms on forest soils in the Great Lakes, how they are ruining it. Will flathead worms that eat earthworms help save the soil?
Well, that's something that I can't really answer. I don't expect that predatory worms will greatly influence earthworm amounts in forest soils, and whether or not. Okay, so it's a complex question whether earthworms are totally detrimental, somewhat detrimental, somewhat advantageous, or very advantageous in soils. I think in natural forests, they're mostly, we would consider, invasive, and also in those parts of the country where there were native earthworms, they've been very strongly competed against, so we no longer have them to much of an extent. The European earthworms are very dominant. In many parts of northern North America, there were probably very few earthworms before European earthworms were introduced, and so now they're doing a lot of things in the soil. They're mixing soil, but this might be in some cases advantageous. So if we think about, and again, I'm not making a claim one way or another. I'm just trying to say that if we think that carbon can be better stored, particularly in deciduous forest systems, by redistributing the carbon away from the surface, then the presence of earthworms may actually be something that is actually a good thing. Again, it's too complex for me to take sides one way or the other, and I don't think there's a lot we can do to turn back to pre-European conditions in forests. But there might be a silver lining in the way earthworms do redistribute materials. So,
okay. Next, Sue Simon says, is there a difference between fungal and bacterial growth and metabolism with higher temperatures? Does this affect the acidic levels of the soil?
Yes. So the answer is yes. Typically, bacterial growth is enhanced at higher temperatures, and fungal growth is able to be more, how would we say, competitive at somewhat lower temperatures and moisture conditions. Fungi are more sensitive to low moisture conditions than bacteria. Bacteria tend to turn over organic matter much faster and recycle it quicker. And they tend to get to organic matter that fungal hyphae cannot to some extent. So there is a definite difference. As temperatures go up, I think bacterial growth will be enhanced vis-a-vis fungal growth. How does this affect acidic levels in the soil? Well, breakdown of organic matter creates soil acidity to some extent. But it's more effect on the organisms than the other way around, because fungal systems are more prevalent at low pH. So that I'm inclined to think that higher moisture contents and higher temperatures will tend to bring conditions that will bring water through the soil quicker and therefore leach soils faster and creating more soil acidity that way, and that will end up enhancing fungal growth. So again, it's fairly complicated, but there are definite differences, and some of these aren't well understood.
Okay. Sue Simon also asks, is there carbon stored on the ocean floor?
Absolutely. So, the ocean floor is a major storage place for carbon in the form of carbonates. So, millions of little plankton and shell-bearing organisms senesce and die and fall to the bottom of the ocean. So if we think about the greatest carbon store on our planet, it's our carbonate rocks. But we don't consider those, and most of those were formed at the bottom of the ocean as limestone over hundreds of millions of years. We almost ignore them as part of the carbon cycle because they change. They're less amenable to change, but we also, at our peril, have ignored them because, for example, as soil acidifies, that carbonate store is affected by acids in soil water, in moving water, and more carbon dioxide is lost. So the balance over time will be organic carbon in soils is going to be also very strongly involved. So anyway, that's getting off the point, but yes, the bottom of the ocean is over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years the major place that carbon actually gets stored.
Okay, so here's a name from the past, Brian. Bob Vertree says, as northern soils like tundra warm, it is not only CO2 that increases, but methane is perhaps even a greater impact on greenhouse increases, correct?
Absolutely. So, if we think just about carbon dioxide is the end product of aerobic respiration of organisms like us and trees and microorganisms that respire when they can get oxygen. And when they can't, microorganisms need to still respire, and so they go around looking for something else. They might find something like iron oxides they can use in wet soils. They might find something like sulfate they use, and eventually, if they can't find those, they can't find oxygen, oxides, or sulfate. they may go looking for carbon-containing compounds which they can respire, and the end product in those very anoxic, anaerobic environments is methane, like in the stomachs of cows, in very wet soils, and in cold, wet soils in particular, there's more methane production. And so, yes, you're correct. So, but all of the same things that pertain to carbon dioxide in aerobic respiration also happens in anaerobic respiration in terms of greenhouse gases. Yeah.
Maybe he was just testing you, Brian.
Bob always testing. Yeah.
He's good at that. So Sue Magnus says, what are your thoughts about biochar, compost activation for planting, and ideal soil mixes? City of Cincinnati is in planning stage of getting a kiln to make biochar. What type of solid mixes would be best for planting trees to store carbon? So there's a lot of questions in there.
Okay, there's a lot of questions there. So biochar is a form of carbon that's made in made by burning materials in a low oxygen environment. So basically it creates long-term carbon that doesn't create carbon dioxide. And it has many excellent effects of organic matter on soils. It's a very hot topic of research in the soils and other communities right now. So, I'm strongly in favor of it. I'm not sure, that economically it's something that is an ideal way. So I think any way you can get organic materials or carbon into the soil is a good thing. I don't really have much to say about ideal soil mixes. Generally, the more organic matter, the better, and more stable forms of organic matter, the better. So, I think if excess energy or burning of waste products can be used to make biochar, that's probably a good use of energy in terms of creating a material that does have positive effects on the soil, not just in sequestering carbon, but also improving soil physical and other properties. So I'm not an expert on soil mixes, but I certainly think anything you can do to involve organic matter, whether it be manure or compost or biochar, all of those things are excellent for use in mixes. But it'll depend on the kind of plants you're trying to grow, the balance of different materials that you would need.
Okay. Frank asks, what is the impact for forest regeneration if the quality of the soil, if it has been subject to a very hot forest fire? So I guess, do hot forest fires impact the soil quality for regeneration?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So, there are a very wide range of effects. These include the loss of of all and most of the above ground biomass. In very hot fires, you do not leave much in the way of new material for regeneration. You kill even microorganisms and all kinds of detritivores in the surface part of the soil. You've volatilized a lot more of the carbon. So, the hot fires are far worse than any others. They also bake the soil in ways that change the soil mineralogy. This may create new clays that tend to cement together. They tend to therefore increase soil erosion. But I think the most significant effect is the loss of organic matter and the loss of organisms that can be involved in regeneration of the soil. Everything from new seeds and seedlings that are still there to vegetative reproduction of the understory that may survive a lower temperature fire. If you just get rid of everything, you've got a very poor situation for regeneration. And the longer it takes to regenerate, the more that negative feedback on terms of soil quality. So you get more soil erosion, you get more compaction, you get more loss of physical materials, you get more leaching, you get all kinds of things happening that are disincentives to that regeneration itself. So hot fires are not a good thing in most places. They may have a role in some places. In Australia, where I come from, many of the eucalypt forests, the major forest type in Australia, they are stabilized by hot fires. But you have understory that you have plants that are highly volatile constituents of oils in their leaves, and so they have very hot fires, but it's the top part of the tree that burns rather than it getting close to the ground. And many of the seeds are scarified by that burning. So you have Myrtaceae, melaleucas, and all of these other plants and eucalypts themselves. Many of these actually need to have hot fires to regerminate. But that's a specific situation in our deciduous forests and coniferous forests in the United States. Most of our forest types are really not terribly resistant to very hot fires. But I'm also speaking well outside my lane here. And but there are a few things that I do know. Yeah.
Well, we do have conifer species in the West that need the fire to pop the cones, for regeneration. So there's a need for some, but the hot fires definitely are detrimental to the forest in the short term, at least. So Sue asks, is there a large amount of carbon stored in Antarctica?
In Antarctica?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you take the continent as a whole, Antarctica has the least amount of carbon storage. But the reason for that is it's ice. Okay, those areas of Antarctica that are ice-free have very large amounts of carbon for two reasons. They're cool and they're wet. So you have tundra vegetation over some of those areas and large amounts and wetlands. And so those ice-free areas in Antarctica are amongst per unit area the highest, but as a continent, very little, because those areas are quite small compared to the total extent of Antarctica.
Okay. Richard asks, will acclimation occur on plants and will they grow to that adaptation? So I guess as the soils adapt and change, do we expect the plants? I don't know if I expect plants to adapt as much as maybe shift, or they're growing.
Yeah, I think just remember that an individual plant can't adapt fast enough. So if the conditions that are ideal or even required for a particular plant or even a forest to grow no longer exist, that forest is not going to be able to adapt. You will get ecosystem change. You will get not just habitat change, but you will get a change in species composition that may or may not result. As I mentioned before, we think that there is some kind of stasis below ground, so that the below ground biomass, the below ground plant microorganism communities probably won't change as fast as the above ground, because temperatures don't change as quickly as you go down the soil. But that will create some kind of imbalance because these organisms co-evolved. And so, I don't think the rate of climate change that we perceive, that most of us, that many of us feel is going to happen, is far faster than the rate of adaptation of individuals, and certainly even of whole ecosystems. At least that's the way I see it. Of course, there's some adaptation. Plants can mutate, and the ranges of plants. There's resilience. So resilience is the one thing that has the opposite effect there. So plants don't necessarily have to change straight away, and some are very resilient and some aren't. But the thing is, when you get change, then plants that are resilient tend to dominate over those that are sensitive. And among those things that are resilient are things like invasive species. And so as ecosystems, including forests, come under stress, it's those more resilient, pioneering and invasive species that will first take over before there is a shift towards a new balance of plants.
Okay. Michelle asks, let's see, she was wondering how or if the increase in Ohio's summer temperature and the change in soil as a result will impact agriculture and the types of crops that can be farmed. Example, will future generations still go to their local farmers market to purchase corn?
Yeah, good question. And, I think, again, we don't know what's going to happen, but increased summer temperatures, there's two effects there that I kind of pointed out. Warmer temperatures will mean typically, a longer summer growing period. Okay, so warmer temperatures early in the summer will allow farmers to get their crops in a more timely manner. That could result in better crops in Ohio, right? On the other hand, I mentioned the soil water deficit that we have on average, in mid to late summer. That is the major determinant of crop yield. Neither of those would mean that corn would be not suited to Ohio. I don't think, and to some extent increased productivity. But if we imagine hotter summer temperatures will probably mean that summer deficit period of moisture will be higher. That may be the main influence on crop yields and may reduce overall long-term crop yields in Ohio for corn and soybeans. But again, we don't really know. But some models do tend to show that. But it's kind of a balance. So some increase due to increased moisture and warmer temperatures and earlier planting times will mean higher crop yields, but a higher risk of dry conditions during the deficit period will reduce that. So how that'll break out, it may be a wash, it may fall one way or the other. So I don't think, and again, we don't know what the extremes are going to be. Will the environment be even one that's amenable to farming? We don't know, but I would expect, the changes that we see are probably not going to mean we can't grow major food crops in Ohio. If you're in India, different story. Temperatures are already getting so hot there that, it's hard for people to live, let alone get out and do the farming that they have to do to maintain, what's going to be the world's largest population. So we're in Ohio, we have our challenges with climate change, but nothing like particular other areas of the world.
So Brian, just to kind of follow up on that, do you see then, we typically think of, like, say, corn harvest starts mid to late September into October. Do you see maybe that starting in late August, early September? Do we see maybe those harvest patterns change?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so if you look at, well, I don't know, but if you look at those University of Massachusetts predictions, if Ohio's summer is more like Arkansas, then where they, we've got better soils than them, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's got, Arkansas is going to be more like Mexico, I think, in terms of their temperatures. But at least, again, I'm not an expert on making these predictions or a modeler even, but I do read this stuff like the rest of us do, and as a scientist, I think some of this is what we're most likely to see. Given that, if you see planting dates now. Our winters are still going to stay much colder than Arkansas, probably, or a bit colder. Mm-hmm. So that may that kind of limits how early we're going to be able to plant. But I would think a few weeks earlier, I would think things maturing a little bit faster and probably earlier harvests. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. We have Anonymous asking, is Ohio at risk of desertification, perhaps during the drier times of the year?
Yeah, so desertification has got a wide range of definitions. You know, if we think the actual formation of a desert may be being defined as a place that has less than 90 days of cumulative rainfall, putting soil into a situation where there's stored moisture or enough moisture for normal plants to grow. I don't think we're going to see that. You know, however, desertification, that broad definition includes, you know, destruction of soils to the extent that they can't support much vegetation. We might still get enough rainfall, but they're not supporting vegetation due to severe erosion and compaction, for example. They're all parts of desertification. And I think parts of Ohio, you know, with inadequate land management can and have and could meet that definition. Yes.
Okay.
But not in terms of like actually, you know, making desert soils you know, at least the way we see predictions going. You know, again, I pointed out, you know, warmer conditions, perhaps a bit more moisture, but very intense storms, more drought, you know, more summer moisture deficit some years. All of those things, you know, perhaps some more, you know, strong winds at some time of year. You know, we might get more tornadoes. These are things that we might worry about, but I don't think they, you know, equate to desert. So desertification, if you look at that map, the big areas of worry for desertification in the world are the margins of current deserts. Yeah.
Okay.
And tropical areas.
Okay. Sarah Browning asks, as of our work involves the removal of invasive plants. Could some of this activity, such as using forestry mulchers or herbicides, be doing more harm than good to the soil?
Yes. You know, just thinking about that, and again, I'm not a forest manager, and you know, but I think, you know, invasive plants are still plants. You know, they, you know, weeds have their role, and you know, I'm inclined to think invasive plants are there because there's an imbalance. Generally, we've done things that are detrimental to the balance of the original plant communities, or those that are, you know, in balance with the environment. So I think just removing them and not doing anything to address those imbalances is not a good thing. I think anything that disturbs the soil is going to reduce organic matter. And you know, so you know, as I mentioned, some of these things may not be necessarily intuitive. I mean, the things that create above ground biomass in forests that store carbon may not be the things that are going to store the most below ground carbon in the soil. So, you know, as managers, we have to make trade-offs here. You know, that's not a reason for not growing forests or keeping forests growing. We may not get the most, you know, to create the most soil carbon sequestration, we might want to have grasslands everywhere, but that's not a good thing. You know, we don't want to do that. So, you know, there are trade-offs for other ecosystem services, costs, and everything else. So in answer to your question, I'm sure there are ways to deal with invasive species and land preparation and land management within forests that minimize soil disturbance. And I've talked about some of those. You know, when I talked about soil health last year, you know, I did talk about some of those, but you know, that's definitely something that I think you know, ought to be something that's researched and improved in terms of forest management.
Yeah, and I think that on the invasive plant side, I've been doing some digging through the research about the impacts the invasive plants have on the soil. So some of them, you know, increase the pH. Some of them add things like calcium and manganese and other things they all seem to have some kind of impact on the soil. And I think you have to balance that out with, I mean, if the pH changes, and where I've seen that the most is a couple park districts that have removed buckthorn, and the pH has changed so drastically that the plants they want to put back in that were there before will no longer survive in those pHs.
Right.
So those are the kind of decisions that managers, I mean, because they do impact the soil and what that characteristic is. And so it's not an easy yay or nay. Each site's going to be different. So,
Kathy, I did notice a comment from Kathleen Bradley that earthworms
yes.
do not leave any organic matter in Northeast Ohio forests. Now, this may be true at the surface, but it's not true in the soil. You know, earthworms are detritivores, and they break up surface organic matter and they take it into burrows. You know, European night crawlers do this. They take that soil organic matter into burrows, and they also pass soil through the alimentary systems, and during that process, organic matter is actually incorporated deeper into the soil than it would have been otherwise. So you definitely do lose. I agree that surface duff layers and horizons are strongly influenced by earthworms, but it's not correct that if you consider the forest to be more than the above ground cover, they don't remove all the carbon. That's not right.
Okay. Frank talks about Ohio's forest cover. Since 1990, our forest cover has gone from, well, actually, it was like from the early 1900s, we were at about 10% forested, and now we're at about 31%. It varies a little bit, 30, 31. I believe other states such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, et cetera, have seen similar changes. How big of an impact has that had on carbon storage in soils?
It's had a large influence. However, the issue actually is that sequestering carbon in soil in a forest is a relatively slow process. Okay, so when forests were removed in Ohio, they were mostly replaced with agriculture, mostly.
Right.
So soils were plowed. They may have not have been plowed long term, but when they were plowed, a lot of soil loss happened too through erosion.
Mm-hmm.
And during that period, you know, approximately 30% on average of soil organic carbon was lost from Ohio soils.
Wow.
Approximately 30%. And that's across the state. So we know this from long-term studies. You know, particularly a study that was done by my deceased colleague, Frank Calhoun in Northwest Ohio. He went back the very first day I arrived in Ohio from Australia. I went out with Frank, and then through that first winter, we went out and went back to the old soil survey sites in Northwest Ohio and redug the soil. So those soils were initially analyzed in the 1950s, and you know, by the 1990s, they, you know, many of them had changed and increased back in carbon. But compared to, and we compared areas that were still under woodlots, you know, with many of the other soils, and the loss is about 30%. This has been backed up, you know, in multiple studies and long-term sites across the United States. So when you reestablish forests, you know, you do increase carbon again, you know, but it's relatively slow to be incorporated in the soil. It's a slower process that happens, say, in like lay farming or rotating cropland into cover crops and rotations that put carbon directly into the below ground biomass. But on the other hand, there's more, you know, that increases the above ground biomass. So forests are a good thing, and that increase from 10 to 30% or so has been extremely important for sequestering carbon in Ohio. So don't get me wrong, but in terms of changing the soil, it's an ongoing process, and studies show that the changes have not been, you know, nearly as strong in the soil as in the above ground biomass. Yeah,
Okay.
but over time, you would expect that to increase. but these are managed forests in many cases too. So it takes a long time for that soil carbon to build up. Yeah, we're talking about decadal to centuries to thousands of years. So it's pretty slow.
Okay. I'm going to skip down to this anonymous one because it seems like there's a lot here. Can you see these? Are you looking at these, Brian?
The anonymous one down there.
As temperature increases, evaporation from the warmer seas and freshwater increases. The sun's energy is used in evaporation. This energy is then transferred to moisture in the atmosphere. It's called latent heat. Latent heat has effects on causing more intense precipitation events. And with more intense precipitation events, I think I am correct in saying that erosion will increase during the summer. So shouldn't this also be an important consideration about the effects of summer temperature increases? A question and a response given a few minutes ago.
Yeah, so absolutely, this is exactly right. So erosion is already becoming a more and more serious problem in Ohio. So, we imagine that, we did a lot about erosion, from the late 20s, 30s, when the Dust Bowl happened and the Soil Conservation Service began, activity and farm management and soil conservation districts, etc. All of the work that's been done in forestry for soil erosion, in no-till agriculture and minimum tillage, all of those things. But soil erosion is still an extremely serious problem. And now we see that the influences of climate change will have particular effects. And we know from various studies that it's, in cropland is the worst place for soil erosion. Late in the summer is the worst time. So before the plants completely covered the soil, but when we're starting to get the more intense storms and where we have moisture deficit in the soil, so that the soil is relatively dry. So so what happens, and in fact, I can talk a little bit about this directly because of some research done by one of my students. So we were absolutely stunned. Emma Kurth was her name, and she did a research up at the, what was the Coshocton Research Station, and she looked at, measuring actual soil loss and runoff during the growing season, and it was astounding that even when the crops were growing well, towards the end of July and August, when we got intense storms, there was very serious levels, even under no-till, of soil erosion. So we know that erosion is important, and if we increase the intensity of storms, the more dry period, the one saving grace here, we might have more mature crops that I talked about before. So that might be the one thing that influences better cover later in the growing season. But I think, I'm always cognizant of how serious erosion is in Ohio. We go into fields, even no-till fields, and this spring, we had this wet spring, we had lots of rain. When I was out with my colleagues getting these sites ready for my soil judging contest, all of these were in farm fields, and we saw, and most of them are great cooperators, great people who are doing the right thing, and significant soil erosion, and it's heartbreaking even for those farmers. So erosion is not a problem that's gone away in Ohio.
No, that's true. So Sue's got a couple here that she asked, how do you measure how much organic matter has formed over 1 million years? Or how do you measure the carbon that has been forming for millions of years?
Well, there are multiple ways to do this. I mean, we know that, over millions of years. I presume you're talking about places that are outside of Ohio, because the carbon in Ohio soils is much younger than that. Even in southeastern Ohio, most of the soils were influenced by the glaciation, even if they didn't have ice over the top of them. So I think, but I think over thousands of years, we can actively date carbon in soils. So carbon dating is the one way that's being used to do this, so that you can take carbon out of the soil and work out how old it is by its balance of carbon isotopes. So, you know, that's actually one of the easiest forms of dating for soil. So we can measure the total amount of carbon. We can measure the carbon in various fractions. So as carbon breaks down in the soil, we can measure different kinds of carbon. We can measure carbon that's in the form of particulate matter. We can measure dissolved carbon. We can measure carbon that is changed into shorter chain organic carbon compounds. We can measure carbon that's protected inside soil aggregates. There's so many different kinds, and we can measure those, and each of those has a different age profile. And those can actually be related back to the different kinds of carbon in soils. And so, you know, various dating has been done. I don't know how much has been done in Ohio, but we know fairly generally about the age of carbon in most soils.
Okay. So your anonymous attendee was Bob Vertrees. He's just confessed and said, "Good answer, Brian." He didn't want you to know, apparently. I think we're going to stop there, and because I want to get the stuff out for folks for their continuing ed credits. And